Decades ago, in the quiet town of Port Huron, Michigan, a young woman vanished after attending a bachelorette party with her friends. Her pale green Buick Century was later found abandoned just a few blocks from where she was last seen. A local man was quickly arrested and convicted of kidnapping and murder, and for a brief moment, it seemed that justice had been served. But 3 years later, the truth emerged. He was innocent, and the real killer was still out there, free. Nearly half a century later, when an investigator reopened the long, cold case file, he discovered a tiny detail in an old Polaroid photo that police had overlooked decades earlier. A detail significant enough to change everything. Port Huron, Michigan, November 1980. The cold air had frozen the last vestiges of fall, leaving a brittle silence across Smith's Creek, a small town nestled by the St. Clair River, where the industrial hum of Marysville was a constant low thrum. Leafless trees, stark against a perpetually gray sky, stood guard over quiet streets, where the scent of wood smoke and damp earth clung to the evening. Winter was already breathing down the neck of autumn, a harsh reminder of Michigan's unforgiving seasons. Karen Marie Umphrey, 21 years old, felt the chill in the air as she buttoned her denim jacket tighter. She lived with her mother, Sylvia Umphrey, and 6 of her 7 siblings in their modest home, a place of constant activity and warmth, despite the absence of her father, Thomas Umphrey, who had passed away when Karen was just 10. Sylvia, a woman of formidable strength and endless love, had raised her 8 children with grace and an unyielding spirit. Since graduating high school, Karen had worked diligently as a secretary at Marysville Marine Distributors, handling orders and correspondence with a calm efficiency. Her colleagues, like her supervisor, Arthur Jenkins, often described her as a pleasant, hard-working young woman who cherished her family above all else. Today, November 1st, a Saturday, had been no exception. The crisp autumn day had been spent running errands, culminating in a trip to George's auto shop to get new rims put on her beloved 1973 Buick Century, a pale green sedan that was her pride and joy. George Barnes, the shop owner, had given her a friendly wave as she drove off, promising the new rims would make her car look like a dream. That night, at about 6:30 p.m., Karen left the comforting glow of her family home. She shared a quick hug with her younger sister, Lisa Umphrey, who was drying dishes, and a fond wave to her mother, Sylvia, who was mending a sweater by the television. "Don't be out too late, honey," Sylvia called out, a familiar refrain. Karen smiled, promising she wouldn't, as she headed out for a combined bachelor and bachelorette party for her friends, Richard Ritchie Jensen and Kathy Miller, at a rented house on McBrady Street in Port Huron. The air hummed with anticipation. Ritchie and Kathy were a beloved couple, and their impending wedding was the talk of their social circle. The party at Patricia Donovan's spacious home was in full swing when Karen arrived. Laughter mingled with the thumping bass of popular 80s tunes, and the scent of cheap beer and cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air. Karen, with her wavy brown hair and easy smile, circulated among friends, sharing jokes with Brian Kelly and catching up with her old high school classmate, Jessica Larson. Around midnight, her boyfriend, Frederick Hill, arrived, his usual brooding demeanor softened by the festive atmosphere. Fred, a few years older than Karen, had a volatile temper, but Karen saw a tenderness beneath his rough exterior. The night wore on, the hours blurring into a haze of celebration. Sometime in the early hours of November 2nd, Karen and Fred decided to leave. They stepped out into the biting Michigan cold and got into her green Buick, which was parked along Varney Street, just off 10th Street. The short drive quickly soured. An argument, fueled by alcohol and underlying tensions, erupted between them. Words, sharp and unforgiving, were exchanged. Fred, in a sudden fit of anger, pulled the passenger door open, got out of the car, and began walking home down 10th Street, his heavy footsteps echoing in the deserted pre-dawn quiet. Karen, her heart aching, got out and followed him for a bit, calling his name, trying to de-escalate the sudden eruption of anger. But Fred, stubborn and proud, refused to stop. Eventually she gave up, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and walked back to her Buick. It sat alone under a flickering streetlight near the intersection of 10th and Varney Streets, its engine now silenced. She slipped back into the driver's seat, the cold leather chilling her skin, the argument replaying in her mind. Back in Smith's Creek, the small house on Cedar Street was quiet. Sylvia Umphrey had drifted off on the sofa, a half-mended sweater falling from her lap. She stirred awake around 3 a.m., a prickle of unease unsettling her. Karen wasn't home. This wasn't entirely unusual, but a mother's intuition was a potent, unwelcome whisper in the pre-dawn silence. She checked Karen's untouched bed, then called out her name softly into the quiet house, hearing only the distant creak of the old furnace. Sylvia tried calling Frederick Hill's number, letting it ring interminably, but there was no answer. A knot of cold dread began to tighten in her stomach. By 4:30 a.m., unable to shake the growing panic, she reached for the phone and dialed the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. Her voice, thin with fear and worry, trembled as she spoke to dispatcher Brenda Whitman. "My daughter, Karen Umphrey. She hasn't come home. I'm afraid something's happened." The call, logged at 4:37 a.m., marked the official start of the search for Karen Umphrey. The next day, November 2nd, the sun struggled to break through the persistent overcast sky. Around 12:10 p.m., Walter Schmidt and Robert Thompson, two lifelong hunting buddies, were deep in the state game area of Beards Hills, Michigan, about 10 miles west of Port Huron. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth as they searched for game. As they moved through a thick clump of dark, slender pine trees, a sight brought them to an abrupt, chilling halt. There, partially concealed by the undergrowth, lay the body of a young woman. She was fully clothed, her denim jacket still buttoned, but her face was pale and still. Her position, about 600 feet east of Abbotsford Road, seemed almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence that had clearly ended her life. The hunters, their hearts heavy with shock, immediately backed away and called the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. The call came into the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office at 12:38 p.m., patched through to the dispatcher, Brenda Whitman. Within minutes, Sheriff Wallace Ford, a man whose weary eyes held the wisdom of decades on the job, was out of his bed, his morning coffee still steaming as he drove his Plymouth patrol car towards Beards Hills. With him rode Sergeant Dale Patterson, a younger officer with a keen mind, whose usual steady demeanor was now tinged with a solemn anticipation. Upon arrival, the scene was already being secured by two patrol officers, William Anderson and Curtis Nolan, who had roped off the area around the pine trees. Sheriff Ford stepped out, the damp earth clinging to his polished boots, and surveyed the grim tableau. Karen Marie Umphrey, her identity quickly confirmed by a missing persons report filed just hours earlier by her frantic mother, Sylvia, lay as the hunters described. A preliminary inspection by the county medical examiner, Dr. Lydia Crane, confirmed she had been sexually assaulted and fatally shot twice in the head. The brutality of the act hung heavy in the cold November air. During the initial autopsy, Dr. Crane meticulously collected all available forensic samples, including biological evidence, though the technology to fully analyze such material was decades away. Ford, his face grim, nodded to Sergeant Patterson. "All right, Dale. Let's get every inch of this place covered. Bring in the K-9 unit. I want every possible lead documented. Patterson, his voice tight, began assigning tasks. Deputies Marcus Thorne and Sarah Gutierrez were dispatched to establish a wider perimeter, while forensic technician Dean Mercer started photographing the scene with a large format camera, the flash popping against the somber backdrop. The ground was cold and damp, making footprints clear in some areas, but also easily disturbed. They noted heavy boot prints, distinct in their thick horizontal treads and rounded toe, leading from the body towards the dirt track. By late afternoon, the initial processing of the crime scene was complete. Karen's body was carefully removed, taken to the county morgue for a full autopsy. The forensic team had collected several pieces of evidence: soil samples, latent prints from the perimeter of the scene, and a few faint fabric fibers from the undergrowth. No weapon was found, nor were there any obvious signs of a prolonged struggle at the immediate burial site. The immediate area around the body was clean, almost as if she had been left there after the violence had already occurred elsewhere. Sheriff Ford and Sergeant Patterson returned to the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office, the scent of pine and death still clinging to their uniforms. The small station, usually a quiet hub of routine calls, now buzzed with a tense energy. Ford, seated at his cluttered desk, stared at a Polaroid photo of Karen, her high school graduation picture, a beaming girl with an easy smile. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling around his tired face. "All right, Dale," he said, exhaling slowly. "Let's start piecing together her last hours. Get Fred Hill in here, and I want to know everything about that party." The first interviews painted a picture of a vibrant young woman who simply vanished. Richard Jensen and Kathy Miller, the soon-to-be married couple, were heartbroken. They confirmed Karen and Fred had left their party sometime in the early hours of November 2nd, but their recollections of the exact time varied wildly. Some guests, like Brian Kelly, insisted it was around 12:30 a.m., while others, including Jessica Larson, placed it closer to 2:30 a.m. This discrepancy was the first frustrating knot in the unraveling thread of Karen's last night. Fred Hill, Karen's boyfriend, was brought in for questioning shortly after. He arrived looking disheveled and pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling as he spoke. He admitted to the argument near 10th and Varney Streets, his voice cracking as he recounted getting out of her car in anger. "She tried to follow me, called my name," he mumbled, staring at the floor. "But I just walked away. I was mad. I went straight home, passed out. Woke up this morning when Sylvia called asking if Karen was with me." His story, while emotionally charged, provided little in the way of leads. He had no alibi for the crucial hours after their argument, a fact that cast a long shadow of suspicion. As the initial interviews continued, a crucial piece of information surfaced. Brenda Whitman, the dispatch operator on duty, confirmed from her shift log that a phone call had come in at 3:37 a.m. that morning. The caller, Evelyn Albright, a retired nurse, had reported a disturbing incident. Evelyn recounted seeing a man forcing a woman at gunpoint into a dark-colored pickup truck near 10th and Water Streets. The truck, she'd stressed, was an older model, a 1965 or 1968 Chevrolet, and it was missing its rear bumper. Sergeant Patterson, his pen scratching furiously, noted the details. This eyewitness account, Evelyn's terrified voice still clear on the recorded line, suggested Karen's abduction had occurred around 2:30 a.m., aligning with the later departure time from the party. It also shifted focus away from Fred Hill, at least momentarily. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Office put out an alert for a dark-colored 1965 to 1968 Chevrolet pickup missing a rear bumper. The description, though vague, was their only real lead. Days bled into weeks. then into the unforgiving chill of Michigan winter. Karen Umphrey's green Buick Century was found abandoned 4 blocks from the party location, locked and untouched, providing no further clues. The case, despite the initial flurry of activity, began to stall. The public, initially gripped by the tragedy, slowly moved on, their attention turning to the upcoming Christmas season. But for Sylvia Umphrey and her family, the silence was deafening, a perpetual aching void. 3 weeks after Karen Umphrey's body was found, the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office was bogged down in dead ends. The few threads they had, the vague description of a pickup truck, the inconsistent party timings, Frederick Hill's unverified alibi, were frayed and unreliable. Sheriff Ford, his face etched deeper with fatigue, sat alone at his desk late one frigid evening, the only sound the rattling of the old heater. He picked up the meager file, flipping through blurred Polaroids of the crime scene, and hastily scrawled witness statements. There was no clear motive, no definitive suspect. The brutal sexual assault suggested a predator, but the lack of struggle at the recovery site was unsettling. Then, a break. On November 28th, Deputy William Anderson, canvassing roadside businesses along Abbotsford Road, stopped at Johnson's Gas and Go, a small, run-down station just a few miles from the Beards Hills game area. The night attendant, Ronald Delaney, a lanky young man with tired eyes, remembered something. "Yeah, that night, around 2:45, 3 a.m., I saw a truck, reddish-brown Ford pickup, not a Chevy. Old model, maybe a 1969 F100 without a rear bumper. Pulled in, filled up, then headed out towards the game area. Driver was a burly guy, looked like he was coming from or going to work." Delaney also noted the truck was a familiar sight in the area. The driver, he was sure, was Calvin Hayes, a local mill worker known for hunting and fishing in the game lands. Sergeant Patterson, hearing this, felt a jolt. A truck, missing a rear bumper, seen heading into the game area around the estimated time of Karen's abduction. And it was a reddish-brown Ford, not the black/dark blue Chevy Evelyn Albright had described. The discrepancy was immediately concerning, but the key detail of the missing bumper and the location made it a lead they couldn't ignore. They decided to follow up on Calvin Hayes. Calvin Hayes, 35 years old, lived in a modest ranch home on the outskirts of Port Huron with his wife, Dorothy Hayes, and 2 young children, Samuel Hayes and Maria Hayes. He worked the night shift at the local lumber mill, a demanding job that often left him exhausted. When deputies William Anderson and Curtis Nolan showed up at his door on November 29th, a Saturday morning, Calvin seemed surprised but cooperative. He was a powerfully built man, his hands calloused from years of manual labor, his face lined beyond his years. "Yes, I was out that night," Calvin admitted, his voice rough. "Finished my shift at the mill around 2:30 a.m., drove straight to Beards Hills, went raccoon hunting, had a couple of traps set up from earlier." He explained he usually hunted raccoons for their pelts during the colder months, a side income to support his family. He drove a 1969 Ford F100, reddish-brown, and yes, it was missing its rear bumper. It had rusted off a year ago, he said. The details matched Ronald Delaney's description perfectly. The officers then asked about his footwear. Calvin readily produced a pair of heavy work boots, caked with dry mud. Sergeant Patterson examined the sole, thick horizontal treads, rounded toe. They looked strikingly similar to the boot prints found at the crime scene. A wave of unease rippled through Patterson. "Mr. Hayes, we're going to need to take these boots for examination, and we'd like you to come down to the station for some further questions." Calvin, though visibly agitated, agreed to cooperate. At the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office, Calvin Hayes sat in a small interrogation room, the stark fluorescent light illuminating the tension in his face. Sheriff Ford and Sergeant Patterson grilled him on his movements that night, his hunting habits, his knowledge of Karen Umphrey. Calvin maintained his story. He hunted raccoons, left at 2:30 a.m., returned home by 5 a.m., exhausted. He denied ever seeing Karen Umphrey or knowing anything about her murder. His story was plausible, but his demeanor was shifting. His eyes darted nervously, and he stammered when pressed for finer details of his hunting trip. "Mr. Hayes," Sheriff Ford said, his voice low, "we'd like you to take a polygraph test, just to clear things up." Calvin hesitated, his gaze fixed on a stain on the wall. "Look, Sheriff, I got nothing to hide. But my wife. She wouldn't understand me being questioned like this." He eventually agreed, his reluctance palpable. The polygraph was administered by Detective Carla Marin, an experienced polygraph examiner from the Michigan State Police. As the needles danced across the paper, tracking Calvin's physiological responses, a grim conclusion emerged. Detective Marin reported back to Ford and Patterson. He failed. Specifically on questions related to his whereabouts at the time of the murder and his knowledge of Karen Umphrey's death. The failure of the polygraph cemented Calvin Hayes as the prime suspect. His initial plausible alibi now looked like a carefully constructed lie. The reddish-brown Ford pickup, the matching boot prints, the hunting story that seemed a bit too convenient for someone who worked a demanding night shift, and now the failed polygraph. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Office believed they had their man. On December 10th, 1980, Calvin Hayes was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Karen Marie Umphrey. The news spread like wildfire through Smith's Creek and Port Huron, a mixture of grim relief and quiet shock. A local man, a family man, accused of such a heinous crime. For Sylvia Umphrey, it was a moment of agonizing clarity, a face finally put to her daughter's tragedy. The trial of Calvin Hayes commenced in March 1981 at the St. Clair County Courthouse, a grand old building with imposing stone columns and echoing hallways that now hummed with the whispers of a community eager for justice. The courtroom was packed, a sea of solemn faces. Sylvia Umphrey sat in the front row, a thin, gaunt woman draped in black, her eyes never leaving Calvin Hayes. With her sat her remaining children, including Lisa Umphrey, their faces etched with grief. The prosecutor, Dominic Vance, a sharp, ambitious attorney from the district attorney's office, laid out the case with chilling precision. Vance painted a picture of Calvin Hayes as a calculating killer, preying on a vulnerable young woman in the desolate gamelands. He presented the compelling circumstantial evidence. Ronald Delaney's testimony of seeing Hayes's reddish-brown Ford pickup heading towards Beard's Hills around the time of the abduction, Evelyn Albright's description of a dark-colored pickup, the similar missing bumper creating a bridge between the two descriptions in the jury's mind, the damning match between Hayes's work boots and the prints at the crime scene, and the chilling report from Detective Carla Marin on the failed polygraph. The prosecution argued that Hayes's initial alibi of raccoon hunting was a clumsy lie, easily exposed, and proof of his guilt. Calvin Hayes, seated at the defense table next to his appointed attorney, Marla Deneen, looked a man undone. His face was drawn, his once powerful hands often clutched together, trembling slightly. Marla Deneen, a diligent but junior lawyer, struggled against the tide of public opinion and the seemingly irrefutable evidence. She tried to cast doubt on the reliability of polygraph tests, argued the truck descriptions were inconsistent, and questioned the definitive nature of the bootprint match. But the prosecution's narrative had taken root. On the third day of the trial, In a dramatic turn that silenced the courtroom, Marla Deneen called Calvin Hayes to the stand. He walked to the witness box, his gaze fixed on his wife, Dorothy Hayes, in the gallery, who sat rigid, her face pale. After reiterating his initial raccoon hunting story, Calvin, his voice barely a whisper, confessed to lying. "I wasn't hunting raccoons," he choked out, his eyes begging for understanding. I was with someone, a woman." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The whispers grew louder, punctuated by Sylvia Umphrey's small, broken sob. Calvin continued, tears welling in his eyes. "I know how this sounds, I know, but I was having an affair with a married woman. We met out in the woods near Abbotsford Road that night. It wasn't far from where her body was found. That's why my truck was there. That's why my boots were there. I lied about the raccoon hunting because I couldn't bear for my wife and children to find out. I was trying to protect them from the shame." The new testimony hung in the air, a desperate, pathetic attempt at an alibi. Prosecutor Dominic Vance, his face a mask of disbelief, tore into Calvin Hayes during cross-examination. "So, Mr. Hayes," Vance scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you want this court to believe that on the night a young woman was brutally murdered and sexually assaulted, you were secretly engaged in an illicit rendezvous, coincidentally, in the very woods where she was dumped? And you chose to protect your shameful affair over clearing your name from a murder charge? You expect this jury to swallow that convenient tale?" Calvin, battered by the questions, could only stammer, "It's the truth. I swear to God." But his words rang hollow. His prior lie, the failed polygraph, and the sheer audacity of his new story painted him as a cunning liar, desperate to escape justice. The jury, comprised of local citizens, exchanged knowing glances. The idea of an affair seemed nothing more than a desperate last-ditch fabrication. After 3 intense days of testimony, the jury retired for deliberation. They returned in less than 2 hours. The foreman, Augustus Thompson, a local farmer, stood, his voice clear and unwavering as he read the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Calvin Hayes, guilty." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Sylvia Umphrey let out a cry of raw anguish, collapsing into Thomas Umphrey Jr.'s arms, a mix of grief and profound relief washing over her. Calvin Hayes, however, stood frozen, his face devoid of expression, as if the words hadn't quite registered. Judge Malcolm Sterling, a stern, seasoned jurist, then delivered the sentence, 40 years to life in Michigan State Prison. The gavel struck, a sharp final sound that echoed the closing of a chapter, marking the end of the initial hunt for Karen Umphrey's killer. Calvin Hayes was transported to the Michigan State Prison in Jackson, his world reduced to concrete walls and iron bars. He was assigned to a cell with Vernon Blake, a quiet man serving time for robbery. Hayes clung to the belief that the truth would eventually emerge, but days turned into weeks, then months, then a full year. His letters to his wife, Dorothy, went unanswered. His children, Samuel and Maria, were told he was away working. He became a ghost, erased from the world he knew, his affair a secret that had ironically condemned him. Meanwhile, life in Port Huron gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. The Umphrey family began the slow, painful process of grieving, believing that justice had been served. The case of Karen Marie Umphrey was officially closed, and the case files were finalized and archived according to standard procedure at the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Ford and Sergeant Patterson, though exhausted, felt a sense of duty fulfilled. The killer had been caught. The community, though still scarred by the brutality, could finally breathe a little easier. But 3 years after Calvin Hayes's conviction, in the spring of 1984, an unexpected letter arrived at the Clair County Sheriff's Office, addressed directly to Sheriff Ford. It was from a woman named Lorraine Gray. She claimed to have critical information regarding the Karen Umphrey murder case, information that would change everything. Sheriff Ford, initially skeptical, called her in for an interview, wondering what new, desperate plea an old case could possibly bring. Lorraine Gray, a woman now carrying a heavy burden of guilt and fear, finally stepped forward. She was the married woman Calvin Hayes had been with in the woods on the night Karen Umphrey was murdered. Lorraine Gray sat across from Sheriff Ford in a small windowless interrogation room, the stark white walls seeming to magnify her visible anxiety. Her hands twisted a worn handkerchief, and her gaze, when it met Ford's, was filled with a desperate, fragile resolve. She was a woman in her late 30s, her face etched with a decade of unspoken secrets. She had worked at the same lumber mill as Calvin Hayes, though in a different department, and was married to a man named Harold Gray, a stern, unforgiving individual known for his volatile temper. "I heard about Calvin's appeal being denied last month," Lorraine began, her voice a reedy whisper, "and I just couldn't keep quiet anymore. It's been eating at me." She described the clandestine affair she and Calvin Hayes had been carrying on for months, a desperate escape from the suffocating realities of their lives. On the night of November 1st, 1980, after Calvin's shift at the mill, they had arranged to meet, as they often did, in a secluded spot in the Beards Hills game area, a small hidden clearing off a service road not far from Abbotsford Road, but deep enough to ensure privacy. Lorraine recounted the night in vivid detail, arriving in her own vehicle, a modest 1975 Chevrolet Nova, parking it a short walk from their rendezvous point. Calvin pulling up in his reddish-brown Ford pickup, its missing bumper a familiar detail she hadn't given a second thought. Their hushed conversation, the stolen moments of intimacy under the cold, indifferent Michigan sky. They had stayed for over an hour, leaving just after 4 a.m. Lorraine had driven home, her heart a mix of guilt and fleeting passion, never suspecting the tragedy unfolding around them. Sheriff Ford listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Lorraine's story, while shocking in its revelation of an illicit affair, was remarkably consistent, detailing specific times, locations, and even minute observations about the weather and their surroundings that night. She offered to take a polygraph, desperate to prove her honesty now that she had found the courage to speak. The polygraph, administered by Michigan State Police Detective Constance Brown, produced a dramatically different result than Calvin Hayes's test. Lorraine Gray passed with flying colors. Detective Brown, a seasoned veteran, reported to Ford and Sergeant Patterson that there was no indication of deception. Lorraine was telling the truth about her rendezvous with Calvin Hayes in the Beards Hills game area on the night Karen Umphrey was murdered. A cold, heavy knot formed in Sheriff Ford's stomach. The implications were staggering. If Lorraine Gray was telling the truth, and the polygraph suggested she was, then Calvin Hayes's desperate courtroom testimony, once dismissed as a transparent lie, was in fact his alibi. And if his alibi was true, then a terrifying reality loomed. An innocent man had spent 3 years behind bars, and Karen Umphrey's real killer had walked free for just as long. Sergeant Patterson, usually composed, ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "We got it wrong," he muttered, the words heavy with the weight of professional failure. "We got it badly wrong." Ford said nothing, only stared out the window, the image of Calvin Hayes's haunted eyes from the trial flashing in his mind. The conviction, once a source of grim closure for the community, now felt like a profound betrayal of justice. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Office moved quickly, though quietly. Lorraine Gray's testimony was formally documented. Her statement, combined with the new polygraph results, was presented to the St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office. Prosecutor Dominic Vance, initially resistant and defensive of his successful conviction, found himself facing an undeniable truth. The evidence, though late, could not be ignored. In May 1984, Calvin Hayes was brought before Judge Malcolm Sterling again. This time, he was not there for an appeal, but for a hearing on new evidence. Lorraine Gray, visibly nervous but resolute, testified under oath, detailing her affair with Calvin and their secret rendezvous in the woods on the night of November 1st, 1980. She provided specific details of Calvin's truck, his demeanor, and their time together, details that were now independently verified by her polygraph. The revelation sent shockwaves through the legal community and, as word inevitably leaked, through Port Huron. The affair, once viewed as a pathetic lie, was now his tragic truth. Judge Sterling, after reviewing all the new evidence, including Lorraine Gray's testimony and polygraph results, made a somber declaration. He acknowledged the profound injustice that had occurred. With no other evidence directly linking Calvin Hayes to Karen Umphrey's murder, the boot prints and truck sighting now having an innocent explanation, the judge ordered his immediate exoneration. 3 years and 5 months after his conviction, Calvin Hayes walked out of Michigan State Prison a free man. He was met not by a welcoming family, but by his attorney, Marla Deneen, and a few reporters hungry for a story. His wife, Dorothy Hayes, had divorced him a year into his sentence, unable to reconcile herself with his alleged guilt and the subsequent public shame. His children, Samuel and Maria, had been raised believing their father was away for work, a narrative that would now shatter. Calvin Hayes, a free man, was also a broken man, stripped of his family, his reputation, and 3 precious years of his life. The exoneration of Calvin Hayes left the Umphrey family devastated, their hard-won sense of closure ripped away. Sylvia Umphrey, her grief renewed, felt a fresh wave of despair. "It's like she died all over again," she wept to Lisa Umphrey, holding a framed photo of Karen. The public was stunned and outraged. Questions swirled about the competence of the initial investigation, the reliability of polygraphs, and the speed of justice. The case of Karen Marie Umphrey was reopened, returned to square one, a grim, unsolved murder that cast a long, cold shadow over St. Clair County. The file, once marked "Closed Conviction," was now stamped "Active, Unsolved," a stark reminder of the elusive nature of truth. The official exoneration of Calvin Hayes in May 1984 sent ripples of disillusionment through the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Wallace Ford, a man who had built his career on a steadfast belief in justice, felt the weight of the mistake deeply. He ordered the Umphrey file, once carefully archived, pulled back onto the active shelf. Sergeant Dale Patterson, too, was visibly shaken. The boot prints, the polygraph, Ronald Delaney's testimony, all had once seemed so damning. Now they were a testament to the fragile nature of circumstantial evidence and human fallibility. The reopened investigation, however, found itself quickly cold once more. The years had not been kind to the initial leads. The reddish-brown Ford pickup, once a key piece of evidence, was now known to belong to an innocent man. Evelyn Albright's description of a dark Chevrolet pickup, missing its rear bumper, remained tantalizing but frustratingly vague. Despite renewed appeals to the public, no new witnesses came forward. The original physical evidence, soil samples, faint fabric fibers, the sparse latent prints, had been collected and stored using 1980s technology, making sophisticated re-examination difficult with the techniques available in the mid-1980s. Sheriff Ford authorized every available resource for a fresh look, including bringing in Detective Garrett Shaw from the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit for a consultation. Garrett Shaw, a meticulous investigator known for his patience, reviewed the entire file. He interviewed the original witnesses again, including Frederick Hill, whose alibi remained flimsy, but now seemed less suspicious with a known killer still at large. He even re-interviewed Calvin Hayes, now a shell of his former self, who offered no new leads, only a quiet, bitter resentment. The consensus remained. Without new technology or a fresh witness, Karen Umphrey's case was destined to remain unsolved. As the 1980s drew to a close and into the early 1990s, the official Karen Umphrey file sat gathering dust. Sheriff Wallace Ford retired in 1989, his career ending with the persistent, aching shadow of her unsolved murder. Dale Patterson, who had been promoted to Lieutenant Dale Patterson in 1986, now continued to carry the weight of the cold case under the new sheriff, Arthur Stone, who took office after Ford's retirement. Investigative technology, while slowly advancing, still lacked the revolutionary breakthroughs that would one day redefine forensic science. DNA profiling was nascent, not yet routinely applied to cold cases, and genetic genealogy was still decades away from concept. Then, on October 12, 1994, a peculiar new development emerged. June Arnett, a homemaker from Port Huron in her early 60s, contacted the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. She had found a slip of paper tucked deep inside her family Bible, a King James edition passed down from her grandmother, Martha Caldwell, tucked away in the attic. On the small, yellowed scrap, written in a shaky, almost childlike hand, was a single, chilling name: Jasper Crowley. June Arnett, her voice trembling, explained that she had been cleaning out her grandmother's old belongings when she stumbled upon the Bible. She couldn't explain why the name was there or whose handwriting it was, but a gut feeling told her it was important. She recalled her grandmother, Martha Caldwell, a deeply religious woman, had been keenly interested in Karen Umphrey's murder at the time, often talking about the injustice. Sheriff Arthur Stone, now overseeing the office, was highly skeptical. A name found on a slip of paper in an old Bible years after the fact? It sounded like a desperate attempt for attention, or perhaps the musings of a grieving old woman. However, he couldn't simply dismiss it. He ordered a background check on Jasper Crowley. Jasper Crowley, then 46 years old, was a Port Huron native, a man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life, working various odd jobs in construction and maintenance. He had no serious criminal record beyond a few minor traffic infractions. Lieutenant Dale Patterson, tasked with the follow-up, brought Jasper Crowley in for an interview. Jasper Crowley, a stocky man with wary eyes, expressed surprise and confusion, claiming he had no idea why his name would be in June Arnett's grandmother's Bible or why he was being questioned about a murder from 14 years ago. He denied any involvement with Karen Umphrey. Despite his denials, the weight of the unsolved case and the eerie, unexplained appearance of his name pushed Lieutenant Patterson to authorize a polygraph. Administered by Detective Carla Marin once more, the test for Jasper Crowley produced an inconclusive result. Not a clear failure like Calvin Hayes, but ambiguous enough to keep suspicion lingering. Lieutenant Patterson also compared Crowley's shoe size with the boot print size recovered at the 1980 crime scene, but they did not match. Crowley maintained his innocence, but the doubt persisted. Without any other physical evidence to connect him to Karen Umphrey or the crime scene, and with no clear motive, the St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office felt they lacked sufficient grounds for an arrest or charge. Jasper Crowley was cleared of immediate involvement, though his name remained flagged in the cold case file. The incident, however, made Lieutenant Patterson wonder about June Arnett's true intentions. He suspected she might have known something more concrete, perhaps harbored a personal vendetta against Crowley, and had fabricated the story about the Bible slip to draw attention to him. The strange lead, after a brief flicker of hope, ultimately went nowhere. The case, once again, returned to its silent, dusty resting place, a poignant reminder of justice delayed, now twice. Years bled into decades, the memory of Karen Umphrey fading in the collective consciousness of St. Clair County, becoming just another tragic story in the local archives. The file on Karen Marie Umphrey, labeled Umphrey, Karen M., Homicide Unsolved, grew thicker with time, its pages brittle, its Polaroids faded to sepia tones. It moved from the active cabinet to a locked storage room, then eventually to the basement archives of the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office, alongside countless other unresolved tragedies. The 1990s gave way to a new millennium, then to the early 2000s, but no new leads emerged. Lieutenant Dale Patterson retired in 2003, having served his county for over 3 decades, the cold shadow of Karen's case, a lingering regret in his distinguished career. Sheriff Arthur Stone, too, retired, replaced by a succession of new sheriffs who inherited the dusty files and the community's quiet longing for answers. For Sylvia Umphrey, the decades were a slow, agonizing crawl. She moved from Smith's Creek to a smaller apartment in Port Huron, but Karen's absence was a constant, palpable ache. Her children, now grown with families of their own, tried to offer comfort, but nothing could fill the void left by their lost sister. The family held quiet memorials each November 2nd, lighting candles, sharing stories of the vibrant girl Karen had been. They never gave up hope, even as the world around them forgot. But the world was changing. In the late 2000s, a new scientific revolution began to sweep through forensic law enforcement, forensic genetic genealogy. This groundbreaking technique, capable of building family trees from minute DNA samples, offered a beacon of hope for cases long deemed unsolvable. In 2022, inspired by breakthroughs in other states, Sheriff Matt King, the current head of the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office, made a bold decision. He authorized the Michigan State Police to revisit the Umphrey case, specifically focusing on the surviving forensic evidence. The Michigan State Police, under the guidance of Captain Olivia Shaw of their Cold Case Division, carefully retrieved the original evidence from the crime scene. The samples were meticulously catalogued and prepared. Despite 42 years having passed, forensic technician Dr. Lena Chen was hopeful. The original evidence collection from the 1980 autopsy, though rudimentary by modern standards, had preserved a crucial biological sample, semen recovered from Karen Umphrey's body. In March 2022, the Michigan State Police Laboratory, in collaboration with Othram Inc., began the painstaking process. Dr. Miles Corbin, Othram's lead forensic geneticist, supervised the extraction of the degraded DNA from the 42-year-old semen sample, amplifying it to create a comprehensive, forensic-grade genome sequence. This wasn't merely a CODIS profile, it was a full genetic blueprint, rich with ancestral markers. Once the profile was meticulously built, it was handed over to Othram's in-house forensic genetic genealogy team, led by Chief Genetic Genealogist Carla Davis. Dr. Davis's team, comprised of seasoned genealogists like Wesley Rourke and Teresa Reynolds, embarked on a meticulous journey through public genealogy databases. They began building a family tree from the unknown suspect's DNA, branching out through distant cousins, tracing lines back through generations. It was like assembling a massive, intricate puzzle with missing pieces. For weeks they worked, cross-referencing public records, old obituaries, census data, tirelessly narrowing down potential family lines. Eventually, after months of painstaking research, a clear lead emerged. The genetic profile pointed strongly to a family line with roots in the Port Huron area, specifically bearing the surname Laming. The genealogy team developed a list of potential suspects, individuals whose family trees intersected with the unknown DNA donor. In November 2022, Dr. Carla Davis's team provided these crucial leads to the Michigan State Police and the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. Detective Sergeant Aaron Green, a sharp, tenacious investigator with the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit, was assigned to follow up. Green, a man with a reputation for unwavering persistence, received the file, his eyes scanning the name at the top. Karen Umphrey. He knew this was not just another cold case. This was a second chance at justice, decades overdue. Detective Sergeant Green, working closely with Sheriff Matt King's team, systematically investigated each of the names provided by Othram. Their first, most promising lead was Raymond Laming, a man in his early 70s with a minor criminal record who had resided in Port Huron in 1980. Green and his partner, Detective Renee Dalton, began discreet surveillance. One chilly afternoon, they watched Raymond Laming leave a diner, discarding a half-empty coffee cup in a public trash receptacle. Detective Dalton, with gloved hands, quickly retrieved the cup, which was immediately sent for DNA analysis. Days later, the lab results arrived. Raymond Laming's DNA did not match the crime scene sample. The initial surge of hope deflated, but the team knew the Laming family line was still correct. The killer was a close relative. The genealogists returned to their databases, expanding their search within the Laming family tree. Their efforts soon focused on another individual, Douglas Laming, a cousin of Raymond Laming. Douglas Laming, born in 1948, was then 74 years old. He resided in Fort Gratiot, Michigan, a part of St. Clair County, and had lived in the Port Huron area for most of his life. At the time of Karen Umphrey's murder in 1980, he would have been 32 years old. He had a history of minor arrests for public intoxication and disorderly conduct in his younger years, but no prior felony convictions. Detective Sergeant Green and Detective Dalton shifted their surveillance to Douglas Laming. They spent days observing him, noting his routines. One morning, as Douglas Laming took out his trash, a discarded water bottle was clearly visible. Detective Dalton seized the opportunity, retrieving it before the garbage truck arrived. The sample was rushed to the lab. While awaiting definitive results, Green and Dalton conducted further background checks. Detective Dalton spoke with Beatrice Langford, a longtime neighbor of Douglas Laming in Fort Gratiot. Beatrice, a woman with a sharp memory, recalled that Douglas Laming had, at one point, owned a dark-colored Chevrolet pickup truck. "Oh, yes," Beatrice had stated, "an old one, from the 60s, either a 65 or 68, and I remember it missing the bumper. He used to complain about it." The information hit Detective Sergeant Green like a physical blow. Evelyn Albright's 1980 description of the abduction vehicle, a dark 1965 or 1968 Chevrolet pickup with a missing rear bumper, now had a chillingly specific owner. The lab results came back swift and irrefutable. Douglas Laming's DNA profile was a 99.9999% match to the semen recovered from Karen Umphrey's body. The 4-decade-old mystery had found its name. The evidence was overwhelming. On December 12, 2023, 43 years after Karen Umphrey's brutal murder, Douglas Laming was arrested in his hometown of Fort Gratiot. He was brought to the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office interrogation room, a sterile space designed to strip away pretense. Detective Sergeant Green and Detective Dalton sat across from him. They had decided on a strategy. Withhold the DNA evidence initially, let Douglas Laming talk himself into a corner, and see what truths or lies emerged. "Mr. Laming," Detective Sergeant Green began, his voice calm but firm, "we're here to talk about Karen Umphrey." Douglas Laming, 74 years old, his face weathered but his eyes surprisingly sharp, just shook his head. "Karen Umphrey? I don't know any Karen Umphrey. Never heard the name before." Detective Dalton placed a photograph of Karen on the table. "This young woman, does she look familiar to you?" Laming glanced at the photo, then looked away quickly. "No, can't say I do. I work hard, keep to myself." Green leaned forward. "Mr. Laming, we have information. A neighbor, Beatrice Langford, remembers you owning a dark-colored Chevrolet pickup in 1980, a 65 or 68 model, and she distinctly remembers it was missing its rear bumper. That description, Mr. Laming, matches the vehicle seen at 10th and Water Streets on November 2nd, 1980, the night Karen Umphrey was abducted." Laming's composure faltered. A flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed his eyes. He cleared his throat. "A truck? I might have had an old truck like that, but I wasn't anywhere near there." He paused, then slowly, reluctantly, his gaze fixed on the table, he changed his story. Okay. Maybe I did know Karen. A little. We had consensual relations that night, in the game area, but she was alive when I left her, I swear. She was fine." His admission, though partial, was a chilling confirmation of his presence with the victim. "So you were with her in the game area, Mr. Laming?" Detective Dalton pressed. "And you left her alive? Who did you leave her with?" Laming's eyes darted. He took a deep breath, constructing a new narrative. There was another man. Anthony Harris. He was in the game area, too. I saw him there. He seemed to be following her after I left. Maybe he did something to her. Yeah, it must have been Anthony Harris. He was a rough one, always looking for trouble. Douglas Laming, desperate to deflect, had just handed them a new name, an accomplice. The detectives exchanged a subtle glance. They knew Douglas Laming was lying about Harris being the killer, given the DNA match directly to Laming himself. But Harris's name was a new lead, a critical piece that Laming had, in his panic, revealed. They pressed Laming for details about Anthony Harris, his whereabouts, their connection. The implication was clear. Douglas Laming had an accomplice, and the investigation had just taken another unexpected turn. The news of Douglas Laming's arrest sent shockwaves through the community, particularly among those who still remembered Karen's tragic disappearance. For Sylvia Umphrey, now in her 80s, the news was a surreal, almost unbelievable moment. After decades of pain, false hope, and the profound injustice of Calvin Hayes's wrongful conviction, a name, a real name, finally offered the prospect of true closure. The revelation of Anthony Harris's name ignited a new, furious phase of the investigation. While Douglas Laming sat in his cell, maintaining his partial admission of consensual contact but resolute denial of murder, Detective Sergeant Aaron Green and Detective Renee Dalton pivoted their focus. They knew Laming's DNA was the definitive link to the crime, but the implication of an accomplice, especially one named by the primary suspect, was too significant to ignore. Harris's existence could strengthen the prosecution's case or complicate it, but either way, he was a key to unlocking the full truth of that horrific night. Through Laming's scattered details and a quick background check from Sheriff Matt King's team, Anthony Harris was quickly identified. Born in 1961, he would have been 19 years old at the time of Karen Umphrey's murder, a mere acquaintance of Douglas Laming through local odd jobs and a shared circle of associates. He currently lived in a dilapidated apartment complex in Port Huron, a place haunted by the faint scent of stale cigarettes and desperation. On February 6, 2024, Detective Sergeant Green and Detective Dalton arrived at Anthony Harris's doorstep. Harris, then 63 years old, was a gaunt figure with nervous eyes and perpetually shifting weight, a stark contrast to Douglas Laming's stoic defiance. He was arrested for his suspected role as an accomplice in Karen Umphrey's abduction and murder. The interrogation of Anthony Harris began hours later, a grueling session designed to break his long-held silence. In the sterile interrogation room, Detective Sergeant Green took a measured approach, while Detective Dalton watched Harris's every twitch. "Mr. Harris," Green began, "we're here to talk about Karen Umphrey and Douglas Laming." Harris, fidgeting in his chair, shook his head vehemently. "Karen? Laming? I don't know anything about that. I barely knew Doug. Just a few odd jobs, you know? Back then, everyone knew everyone, but nothing serious." He denied being with Laming on the night of Karen Umphrey's disappearance, claiming he was home alone, drunk, and passed out. He stuck to this denial for hours, his voice growing hoarse, his denials increasingly frantic. Detective Dalton, seeing an opening, leaned forward. Her voice dropped, a deceptive softness in her tone. "Mr. Harris, we know. We have the DNA evidence. We found your DNA on Karen Umphrey's body back in 1980. We've had it all these years. We know you were there, Anthony. We know you were part of it." The lie hung in the air, a devastating weight. Harris visibly flinched, his eyes widening in raw panic. His face went ashen, all defiance draining from him. He stared at the table, then at Green, a tremor running through his entire body. He swallowed hard. My DNA? No, no, that can't be right. I didn't touch her like that." Green pressed, his voice unwavering. "Then tell us, Anthony. Tell us what happened. Tell us your part. This is your chance." Harris broke. The dam burst, years of suppressed guilt and fear pouring out. His voice, now a ragged whisper, recounted the chilling details of November 2nd, 1980. He admitted that he had been with Douglas Laming that night. They had been cruising in Laming's dark Chevrolet pickup, the one missing its rear bumper, drinking beer and looking for trouble. They saw Karen Umphrey, alone in her Buick, after Frederick Hill had stormed off. Laming, ever the aggressor, had ordered Harris to help. Together, they had forced a struggling Karen into the back of the pickup truck at gunpoint, just as Evelyn Albright had witnessed from a distance. Harris confirmed Laming was the one holding the gun. They drove her out to the isolated Beards Hills State Game area. Harris described the terrifying silence of the woods. After they arrived, Laming, his face grim and determined, told Harris to go wait by the truck. Harris, intimidated and terrified, complied. He walked away from the pine trees, back toward the truck, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind reeling from the violence he had just participated in. Moments later, from the darkness, he heard two distinct gunshots echo through the cold, still air. He froze, his blood running cold. He didn't see Laming pull the trigger, but he knew. He knew what had happened. He got back into the truck, and Laming returned shortly after, silent, his face unreadable. They drove off, leaving Karen behind in the chilling anonymity of the woods. Harris finished, his body trembling, tears streaming down his face. He confessed to participating in the abduction and helping transport Karen, and admitted to covering up the crime for over 4 decades, living with the unbearable secret. He agreed to fully cooperate with investigators and testify against Douglas Laming in exchange for a plea agreement that would grant him immunity from the murder charges, instead facing a lesser sentence for his role as an accomplice. The details of his story, particularly Laming's truck and the 2 gunshots, corroborated key pieces of the fragmented evidence collected decades ago. With Douglas Laming's DNA a definitive match, Evelyn Albright's archived witness statement, Mildred Langford's testimony about Laming's truck, and now Anthony Harris's detailed confession, the case against Douglas Laming was watertight. The St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office, now led by the sharp and experienced District Attorney Michael D. Wendling, moved swiftly. The trial of Douglas Laming commenced in October 2024 at the St. Clair County Courthouse, over 44 years after Karen Umphrey's life was brutally taken. The courtroom was a crucible of raw emotion and legal strategy, packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and, most importantly, the Umphrey family. Sylvia Umphrey, frail but resolute at 84, sat with her children, including Lisa Umphrey and Diana Umphrey, their faces a testament to decades of silent suffering. District Attorney Michael D. Wendling, a composed yet commanding presence, opened the prosecution's case. He meticulously presented the irrefutable DNA evidence from Othram, displayed images of the lab reports, and brought in Dr. Miles Corbin, Othram's lead forensic geneticist, to explain the definitive 99.9999% match of Laming's DNA to the semen recovered from Karen's body. He then wove together the eyewitness accounts and new investigative leads, Beatrice Langford's testimony about Laming's distinct truck, and the chilling 1989-11 call from Evelyn Albright, now played as an audio recording, her terrified voice echoing through the courtroom, describing the abduction. Then came Anthony Harris. He took the stand, his demeanor now subdued, his testimony delivered in a low, remorseful tone. He recounted in agonizing detail how he and Douglas Laming had forced Karen into the truck at gunpoint. He described driving her to Beard's Hills, Laming's command for him to wait, and then the indelible sound of 2 gunshots from the woods. His testimony painted Douglas Laming as the direct aggressor and killer, but Laming's defense attorney, Warren Doyle, a shrewd and formidable legal mind, launched a fierce counterattack. Doyle conceded Laming's DNA was present, arguing his client's admission of consensual relations was truthful, that he had merely had sex with Karen Umphrey and left her alive. He systematically dissected the prosecution's remaining evidence, aiming to introduce reasonable doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Doyle declared, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "the prosecution has presented DNA evidence which we do not dispute indicates consensual contact, but that is not proof of murder. Mr. Harris, a confessed accomplice, a man who drove an innocent girl to her death, now seeks to save his own skin by pointing the finger squarely at my client. He claims he heard gunshots. He claims he knew what happened, but he admits, under oath, he did not see. Mr. Laming pulled the trigger. He ran away. His testimony is tainted by self-preservation, a desperate man fabricating guilt to lessen his own sentence." Doyle then turned to Evelyn Albright's archived testimony. "And what of the 1980 eyewitness, Ms. Evelyn Albright? A critical witness, yes, but one we cannot cross-examine. Her words are frozen in time, unchallengeable. She stated she saw 1 man with a gun forcing Karen Umphrey into a truck. Yet Mr. Harris claims 2 men participated in the abduction. Which is it? 1 man? 2 men? Is her memory over 40 years ago completely accurate? Is Mr. Harris, a confessed abductor, truly reliable? These inconsistencies, ladies and gentlemen, are not minor discrepancies. They are gaping holes in a case that relies on a desperate accomplice's word and an uncross-examinable, decades-old account to convict a man of first-degree murder. The courtroom crackled with tension. Michael D. Wendling, the prosecutor, rebutted forcefully, emphasizing that Harris's admitted involvement lent credibility, not doubt, to his account of Laming's ultimate culpability. He reminded the jury that Harris's testimony corroborated Laming's own admissions of being with Karen in the game area. He argued that the core facts, Laming's DNA, his truck, and now Harris's confession, pointed to Laming as the principal offender beyond any reasonable doubt. The clash was sharp, intellectual, and deeply emotional. The jury, their faces etched with the gravity of the decision, retired to deliberate. The courtroom held its breath, suspended in a silence far heavier than any words. Sylvia Umphrey, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer that had been her constant companion for over 4 decades. Her children, Lisa and Diana, sat beside her, their expressions a blend of exhaustion and fragile hope. Douglas Laming, at the defense table, remained impassive, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. A man whose life had unraveled in a sterile room under the relentless glare of justice. In the jury room, the 12 citizens wrestled with the complexities. The DNA was irrefutable, but Laming's defense attorney, Warren Doyle, had skillfully sowed seeds of doubt around the precise act of murder. Did Harris truly not see? Was Evelyn Albright's decades-old account fully reliable given the discrepancies with Harris's testimony? For many, the details of the crime itself, hidden in the dark woods for so long, remained shrouded in ambiguities. Yet the brutal fact of Karen Umphrey's death, Laming's presence, his false alibis, and Harris's damning confession of the abduction and the gunshots painted a grim picture. After only an hour of deliberation, a remarkably swift decision that surprised many, the jury foreman signaled their return. A hush fell over the courtroom as the jury filed back in. The forewoman, Judith Monroe, a stoic woman with a kind but firm demeanor, stood. Judge Cynthia Lane, a woman whose career spanned the old cases and the new technologies, looked at her expectantly. "Madam Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Lane asked, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, we have," Judith Monroe replied, her voice clear and unwavering. "On the charge of first-degree murder against the defendant, Douglas Laming, how do you find—" Judith Monroe paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, meeting Sylvia Umphrey's tear-filled eyes for a fleeting moment. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Douglas Laming, guilty." No cheers erupted, no shouts of triumph. Instead, a collective, profound sigh of relief swept through the gallery, a release of tension that had bound the community for generations. Sylvia Umphrey, her face streaked with tears, gripped Lisa Umphrey's hand, a silent, deeply felt "thank you" passing between them. Douglas Laming, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion, a slight stiffening of his jaw, a narrowing of his eyes, as if the reality of his condemnation finally penetrated his carefully constructed facade. Judge Lane's gavel fell, sharp and decisive. "In light of the jury's verdict, Douglas Laming, I sentence you to life imprisonment without parole." The words echoed, not just through the courtroom, but through the long, silent corridors of time, bringing an end to the nearly 44-year quest for justice. Court is adjourned. As the judge's gavel struck its final blow, the cold sound echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the old stone walls before fading into silence. Douglas Laming stood, his shoulders slumping slightly. He cast a final, contemptuous glance at the Umphrey family, then at Detective Sergeant Aaron Green, before two bailiffs flanked him, leading him from the courtroom. He didn't look back. As the heavy doors closed behind him, a chapter finally, definitively, ended. For Sylvia Umphrey, the conviction was a bittersweet validation. After decades of grief, the agony of Calvin Hayes's wrongful conviction, and the crushing weight of an unsolved crime, the truth had finally emerged from the depths of time and technology. Sylvia, though still carrying her profound loss, now had the solace of knowing her daughter's killer would face accountability. The Umphrey family expressed their profound gratitude to law enforcement, especially to Detective Sergeant Aaron Green and his Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit, and to the prosecutors who had fought tirelessly to bring the truth to light. In a separate, quieter proceeding, Anthony Harris, due to his cooperation and testimony against Douglas Laming, received a plea deal. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role as an accomplice in Karen Umphrey's abduction and his subsequent cover-up. Justice, in its slow, often circuitous path, had finally touched all involved. Detective Sergeant Aaron Green, after the verdict, stood outside the courthouse, the chill autumn air mirroring the somber relief he felt. He thought of Karen Marie Umphrey, a vibrant 21-year-old forever frozen in 1980. He thought of Calvin Hayes, unjustly imprisoned for 3 years, a victim of circumstance and imperfect science. And he thought of Sylvia Umphrey, whose unwavering hope had spanned nearly half a century. The case had been a testament to the enduring power of modern forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, but also a stark reminder of the fallibility of earlier investigations and the deep human cost of delayed justice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the St. Clair River, Green opened his notebook. He wrote one final line in the now closed file for Karen Marie Umphrey. Case resolved. Killer convicted. Justice, though delayed for 44 years, finally found. He paused, looking out at the fading light over Port Huron. "No one is truly forgotten," he murmured softly to the cold Michigan air. "And truth, however late, always finds its way to light." Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.